Grace, you are nothing without this job. You have nothing. And the only reason you've had a roof over your head all these years, it is because I pity you. Now pack your things. I want you out by tonight.
Ma'am, please, I don't have anywhere to go.
I don't care where you go.
11 years of royalty. 11 years of sleepless nights. 11 years ago of being a good girl.
She scrubbed their floors for 11 years. She wiped their tears when their daughter had nightmares. She warmed their meals, ironed their shirts, and swallowed every insult they threw at her like stones. And when they finally threw her out into the street for the crime of being poor, they had no idea that the same hands they called filthy would be the only hands strong enough to save the one person their entire fortune depended on. If you believe kindness always finds its way back, even after the cruelest betrayal, stay with me until the end of this story, because what happens next will stay with you for a very long time. Welcome back to the channel, where we bring you real, heartfelt stories about family, loyalty, and the quiet strength of people the world overlooks. If this is your first time here, consider subscribing and turning on notifications, because we post stories like this every single day, stories about ordinary people who carry extraordinary hearts. Now, let's begin. Her name was Grace Dawson, and she was 34 years old when she first knocked on the tall iron gate of the Hargrove estate on the outskirts of Charleston, South Carolina. She had grown up in a small rented house 2 counties away, raised by a mother who cleaned houses for a living and a father who left before Grace could remember his face. She never finished college. She never had the luxury of choosing a career path lined with internships and connections. What she had was a work ethic sharpened by necessity, a gentle voice, and hands that never stopped moving. The Hargrove family was one of the wealthiest in the region. Warren Hargrove had built a pharmaceutical research company from nothing, a company that specialized in a rare compound used in a groundbreaking treatment for autoimmune diseases. His wife, Diane Hargrove, came from old money herself, the kind of family whose name appeared on hospital wings and university libraries. Together they lived in a sprawling white house with columns out front, a house that looked like it belonged on a postcard, and behind its beautiful walls lived a kind of coldness that no postcard could ever capture. Grace was hired to be the live-in housekeeper, and later, when their daughter Lily was born, she became something closer to a second mother. Diane Hargrove had little patience for the sleepless nights of infancy. She loved her daughter, in her own way, but love in that household was often measured in appearances rather than affection. It was Grace who rocked baby Lily to sleep when she had colic. It was Grace who sang to her in the middle of the night, old lullabies her own mother used to hum. It was Grace who taught her to tie her shoes, who bandaged her scraped knees, who sat with her through chickenpox and fevers, while her parents attended galas and board meetings. For years, this arrangement worked, if you could call it working. Grace was paid modestly, given a small room near the back of the house, and expected to be invisible unless she was needed. She ate her meals standing in the kitchen, after the family had finished, from whatever was left. She was not allowed to sit at the dining table, not even on holidays. When guests came to visit, she was told to stay out of sight, as though her presence alone might embarrass the family. Diane Hargrove, in particular, seemed to enjoy reminding Grace of her place. She would say things like, "Some of us were born to lead, Grace, and some were born to serve. It's simply the natural order of things." Grace would nod, swallow the words that rose in her throat, and keep working, because she needed the paycheck, and more than that, because she had grown to love the little girl who called her Gigi instead of Grace, a name Lily invented when she was barely 2 years old and could not pronounce it properly. As Lily grew older, she became the light of that cold house. She was curious, kind-hearted despite her surroundings, and remarkably intelligent. She had inherited her father's sharp mind, and by the time she was a teenager, she had begun spending hours in Warren's private research lab, an interest her father encouraged more than anyone expected. What most people did not know, what only a handful of trusted employees and family members knew, was that Lily had become deeply involved in her father's most important project, a rare treatment compound that the company had spent nearly a decade developing. The formula's final calibration, the one detail that made the treatment both safe and effective, existed almost entirely in Lily's mind and in a set of handwritten notebooks she kept hidden in her room. Warren had grown paranoid about corporate espionage over the years, after 2 attempts by rival companies to steal earlier versions of his research. So the final, most delicate adjustments to the formula were something only he and his daughter fully understood, deliberately kept off every company's server, existing only on paper and in memory. If anything ever happened to Lily, the company's most valuable asset, a treatment that could soon be worth billions and help millions of patients, would be lost, or at the very least delayed by years, costing the company everything it had built. Grace knew none of this at the time. All she knew was that she loved that little girl like her own, and that the girl loved her back with a purity that the rest of the household seemed incapable of. Everything changed on a Tuesday afternoon in October, the kind of ordinary day nobody expects to remember until it becomes the day that changes everything. Diane Hargrove had hosted a luncheon for her charity board, a group of wealthy women who spent their afternoons discussing donations while sipping wine that cost more than Grace made in a week. Grace had spent the entire morning preparing the house, polishing silverware, arranging flowers, cooking a 3-course meal from a recipe Diane had insisted on, despite Grace's warning that the sauce might curdle if rushed. It did curdle, slightly, and though most of the guests did not seem to notice, one woman made an offhand comment about the texture being a bit off. Diane's face turned red with humiliation in front of her peers. She said nothing in the moment, smiling through gritted teeth, but the moment the last guest left, her fury exploded. "Do you understand what you just did to me?" she shouted, storming into the kitchen where Grace was cleaning up. 11 years, Grace. 11 years I've kept you in this house, given you a roof, a paycheck, and this is how you repay me? You embarrassed me in front of women who could ruin my reputation with one phone call. Grace tried to explain, her voice trembling. "Ma'am, I told you the sauce needed more time to reduce, but you asked me to plate it early because the guests had arrived." "Don't you dare talk back to me," Diane snapped. "You people always have an excuse. You always think you know better. Well, let me remind you of something, Grace. You are nothing without this job. You have nothing, you are nothing, and the only reason you've had a roof over your head all these years is because I allowed it out of pity." The word pity landed like a slap. Grace stood there, gripping the edge of the counter, feeling the familiar sting of humiliation she had swallowed 1,000 times before. But this time, something inside her cracked just slightly, just enough for a single tear to escape. Warren, who had been in his study during the commotion, walked in at that moment, drawn by the shouting. He looked at his wife, then at Grace, and instead of offering even a shred of defense, he simply said, "Diane, handle it however you see fit. I have a call in 10 minutes. That was the final blow. Not the words themselves, but the indifference behind them. 11 years of loyalty, of raising his daughter as though she were her own, of quietly enduring disrespect, and he could not even look at her. Diane's eyes lit with a cruel satisfaction. "You're done here, Grace. Pack your things. I want you out by tonight." "Ma'am, please," Grace said, her voice breaking. "Lily has a piano recital this weekend. I promised her I would help her practice. She'll be devastated if I just disappear without." "That's not your concern anymore," Diane interrupted coldly. "You should have thought about that before you humiliated me in my own home." Lily, who had just returned from school, walked in at the tail end of the conversation, catching only fragments. Her backpack slid from her shoulder as she looked between her mother and the woman who had practically raised her. "Mom, what's going on? Why is Gigi crying?" "Go to your room, Lily," Diane said sharply. "This doesn't concern you." "It does concern me." Lily's voice cracked with a 15-year-old's frustration and fear. "Gigi isn't just some maid, she's family. You can't just throw her out." "She is an employee," Diane corrected, her tone final. "And employees who cause embarrassment do not get to stay." "This conversation is over." Grace did not argue further. She knew from years of experience that arguing only made things worse. She packed her belongings, which fit into 2 worn suitcases and a cardboard box. Everything she owned after more than a decade of service to this family. Lily cried and begged her parents to reconsider, but Diane remained unmoved, and Warren, true to form, stayed locked away in his study, unwilling to face the consequence of his silence. Before Grace left that night, Lily ran to her, wrapping her arms around her waist, sobbing into her shoulder. "Please don't go, Gigi. Please." Grace knelt down, even though Lily now stood nearly as tall as her, and held her face gently. "Listen to me, sweetheart. No matter what happens, no matter where I am, you will always have a piece of my heart. You are the daughter I never had the chance to raise myself, and nothing your mother says can change that. Do you understand me?" Lily nodded through her tears, unable to speak. "Be strong," Grace whispered. "Study hard, be kind to people, and never let this house make you as cold as the people who forgot how to love." She kissed Lily's forehead one last time, picked up her suitcases, and walked out the same iron gate she had walked through 11 years earlier, this time with nowhere to go and no one waiting for her. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of Grace's life. At 34, with no savings to speak of, since most of her modest income had gone towards supporting her aging mother, she found herself staying at a small motel on the edge of town, then eventually in a shelter when the motel money ran out. She applied for jobs, cleaning positions mostly, but a reference check from the Hargrove household yielded nothing but silence, or worse, a curt comment from Diane that Grace was unreliable and prone to causing problems. Diane made sure, quietly and deliberately, that no one else in her social circle would hire the woman who had embarrassed her at that luncheon. Grace never spoke badly of the family, not once, not even when she had every right to. She simply kept moving forward, taking whatever small jobs she could find, waiting tables at a diner during the breakfast rush, cleaning offices late at night, anything to keep a roof over her head. She thought about Lily every single day, wondering how she was doing, whether she was eating well, whether anyone was there to comfort her during thunderstorms the way Grace always had, since Lily had been afraid of storms since she was a toddler. Nearly 8 months passed this way. Grace eventually found steady work as a caregiver for an elderly woman named Rosalind Carter, who lived alone in a modest home in Savannah, Georgia, just a couple hours from Charleston. Rosalind was kind in a way Grace had almost forgotten people could be. She paid Grace fairly, spoke to her with respect, and often told her over evening tea that she reminded her of her own daughter, who had passed away years before. For the first time in a long while, Grace began to feel like a human being again, rather than a shadow that existed only to serve. Meanwhile, back in Charleston, the Hargrove household had grown quieter, colder. Lily had withdrawn into herself since Grace's departure. She barely spoke at dinner, spent most of her time alone in her room or in her father's lab, pouring herself into her studies and into the research that had become her only real connection to her father. Warren, to his credit, had begun spending more time with his daughter after Grace left, perhaps sensing on some level the void that had been created, but the bond between them remained largely professional, built around formulas and data rather than warmth. It was on a rainy Thursday evening in June, nearly a year after Grace had been sent away, that everything came to a terrifying head. Lily had stayed late at the research facility with her father, working on final preparations for an important presentation to the company's board and a group of potential investors. The treatment they had been developing was finally ready for its last phase of human trials, and years of work were about to culminate in a single, crucial demonstration. Warren had stepped out to take an urgent call from a business partner, leaving Lily alone in the lab for what should have been only a few minutes. What no one anticipated was that Lily, exhausted and rushing to finish organizing samples before her father returned, would come into contact with a compound that had been mislabeled by a junior lab technician earlier that day, an error that would normally have been caught during a routine safety check that had been skipped due to the looming deadline. The compound, in its concentrated and unstabilized form, was toxic if absorbed through the skin in significant quantities, something Lily, despite her intelligence, had no way of predicting because the label she trusted had lied to her. Within minutes, Lily began to feel dizzy. Her vision blurred, her hands began to tremble uncontrollably, and a burning sensation spread rapidly across her palms and forearms where the compound had made contact. She tried to call out for help, but her voice came out as barely a whisper, her throat tightening as her body reacted violently to the exposure. She collapsed onto the lab floor just as her father rushed back in, having heard something crash. Warren's scream echoed through the building as he found his daughter convulsing on the ground, her lips turning a faint shade of blue, her breathing shallow and erratic. He called emergency services immediately, his hands shaking so badly he could barely dial the numbers correctly. And within minutes, paramedics arrived and rushed Lily to the nearest hospital. At the hospital, doctors worked frantically to stabilize her, but there was a problem no one could immediately solve. The compound that had poisoned Lily was experimental, something the hospital's toxicology team had never encountered before, since it existed only within the private research files of Hargrove Pharmaceuticals. Standard treatments were having little effect, and Lily's condition continued to deteriorate as the hours passed. The medical team explained to Warren and Diane, both of whom had rushed to the hospital in a state of complete devastation, that without knowing the exact chemical composition of what their daughter had been exposed to, and without a targeted antidote, they were running out of options and running out of time. Warren realized, in his panic, that the only person who might know enough about the compound's structure to help identify a counteracting treatment was Lily herself, and she was unconscious. His research team back at the facility began combing through files, but the specific stabilizing formula, the one that could potentially neutralize the toxic reaction, existed only in the notebooks Lily kept, notebooks that used a shorthand notation system she and her father had developed together, a system so personal and specific that even his most senior chemists struggled to decode it quickly enough. As the night wore on and Lily's vital signs continued to weaken, Warren sat in the hospital hallway, his head in his hands, confronting for the first time in his life the possibility that his daughter, his only child, the person who represented not just his family's future, but the culmination of everything he had built, might not survive the night. And in that moment of complete helplessness, stripped of his wealth and his status and his ability to simply buy his way out of a problem, a memory surfaced in his mind, unbidden and desperate. He remembered Lily, years earlier, sick with a severe fever that no doctor could immediately explain, and he remembered how it was not him, not Diane, but Grace, who had stayed up 3 nights straight, who had known instinctively what herbal compresses to use to bring the fever down while they waited for specialists, who had once mentioned, almost in passing, that she had studied basic chemistry and pharmacology years ago before life circumstances forced her to abandon her education, back when she had dreamed of becoming a nurse before her family's finances made that dream impossible. It was a desperate, almost irrational thought. Grace had been gone for nearly a year. He had no idea where she was, no way to reach her, and even if he found her, why would she help the family that had treated her so cruelly and thrown her out without a second thought? But desperation makes people do things pride would normally never allow. Warren picked up his phone and began making calls, first to his old household staff, then to acquaintances, anyone who might know where Grace Dawson had gone. It took nearly 3 hours of frantic searching, calls to former colleagues, and finally a lead through the diner, where Grace had briefly worked. But eventually Warren obtained a phone number for Rosalind Carter's residence in Savannah, the elderly woman Grace was now caring for. With trembling hands, feeling more humility than he had felt in decades, he dialed the number. Grace answered on the 3rd ring, her voice cautious, unfamiliar with the caller. "Grace," Warren said, his voice breaking in a way it never had in all the years she had known him. "It's Warren Hargrove. I know I have no right to call you, no right to ask anything of you after everything my family put you through. But Lily is dying, and I don't know what else to do." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Grace closed her eyes, memories flooding back, the image of a small girl clinging to her waist, begging her not to leave, the promise Grace had made to always hold a piece of that child in her heart, no matter what happened. "Tell me everything," Grace said quietly. "Right now," Warren explained as best he could. The exposure, the mislabeled compound, the doctor's inability to identify an effective treatment, the notebooks that held the answer, but that no one could properly interpret in time. As he spoke, something clicked in Grace's memory. During her years in the household, she had often helped Lily organize her study materials, had seen glimpses of those notebooks over Lily's shoulder during long nights of homework, and Lily, so eager to share her passion for science with the only person who ever showed genuine interest in her mind, rather than her family's status, had explained her shorthand system to Grace more than once, treating it almost like a secret language between them, a game they played during quiet evenings when the rest of the house was cold and distant. Grace had never mentioned this to anyone. It had simply been one small, intimate connection between a lonely teenager and a woman who had time to listen when no one else did. "Warren," Grace said, her voice suddenly firm and clear, cutting through years of pain and humiliation, with a resolve that surprised even her. "I might be able to read those notes. Get me to the hospital right now." What followed was the longest 2 hours of Warren Hargrove's life. He sent his driver to Savannah immediately, and Grace, without a moment of hesitation despite everything that had been done to her, grabbed her coat and left with barely a word of explanation to a stunned but understanding Rosalind Carter, who simply told her, "Go save that child. We'll talk when you're back." When Grace arrived at the hospital, Diane Hargrove was standing in the hallway, and for a brief, tense moment, the two women locked eyes. Diane's face was pale, streaked with tears, stripped of all the arrogance and coldness that had once defined her. She looked, for the first time since Grace had known her, like an ordinary, terrified mother. "Grace," Diane said, her voice barely audible, "thank you for coming. I know I have no right to ask this of you." Grace did not respond with anger, though she had every right to. She simply nodded once and said, "Where are the notebooks?" The research team handed her Lily's most recent notebook, filled with dense handwriting, chemical structures, and the personal shorthand notation Lily had developed. Grace sat down at a small table just outside the intensive care unit, her hands trembling not from fear, but from the weight of what was at stake, and began to work. It took her nearly 45 minutes, cross-referencing symbols she remembered from those quiet evenings years ago, with the chemical compound information the lab technicians provided. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to piece together what Lily's shorthand was describing. A specific stabilizing agent that, when combined with a readily available medical compound already present in the hospital's pharmacy, could neutralize the toxic reaction spreading through Lily's system. She brought her findings to the lead toxicologist, a skeptical man who initially hesitated to trust the interpretation of a woman with no formal medical credentials. But Warren, standing beside her, said the words that would echo in Grace's mind for years afterward. "Trust her. She knows things about my daughter that none of us ever bothered to learn. If there's a chance this works, we have to take it. We're out of other options." The medical team, working quickly under the toxicologist's careful supervision, prepared the compound Grace had identified and administered it to Lily. The next hour was excruciating. The entire family gathered outside the ICU, watching through a small window as doctors monitored Lily's vital signs for any sign of change. Diane gripped Warren's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. Grace stood slightly apart from them, not because she wanted to, but because years of conditioning had taught her to keep her distance. Even now, even in this moment. Slowly, Lily's heart rate began to stabilize. Her breathing, which had been shallow and labored, gradually deepened and steadied. The blue tinge that had crept into her lips began to fade. By the time dawn broke over Charleston, the doctors confirmed what the family had been too afraid to hope for. Lily was going to survive. When Lily finally regained full consciousness 2 days later, weak but alive, the first thing she asked for, before her mother, before her father, was Grace. "Gigi?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Is she really here?" Grace, who had not left the hospital in 2 days, stepped into the room, and Lily began to cry, reaching out with trembling arms despite the IV lines and monitors attached to her. Grace held her gently, careful of her injuries, and whispered the same words she had said the night she was forced to leave. "I told you, sweetheart. You will always have a piece of my heart, no matter what." In the days that followed, as Lily recovered and the company quietly worked to correct the safety failures that had nearly cost her life, Warren Hargrove sat down with Grace in a private hospital lounge. He looked older than she remembered, the events of the past few days having carved new lines of exhaustion and humility into his face. "Grace," he began, struggling to find the right words, something that rarely happened to a man used to commanding boardrooms with confidence. "There is no way for me to properly apologize for what my family did to you. We treated you like you were beneath us, when in truth, You were the only one who ever truly saw my daughter, who ever truly cared for her the way she deserved. You saved her life, not just with the antidote, but for years, in ways I never appreciated until it was almost too late. Grace listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap, dignity intact despite the hospital chair's uncomfortable stiffness. I don't need an apology to know my own worth, Mr. Hargrove, she said finally. I know who I am. I know what I've given, and I know what kind of person I choose to be, regardless of how I was treated. But I appreciate you saying it. Diane, who had entered the room partway through this conversation, stepped forward, her usual composure completely absent. Grace, I was cruel to you. Beyond cruel. I said things I can never take back, and I am so deeply sorry. I let my pride and my need for control convince me that treating you as less than human was somehow acceptable. There's no excuse for what I did. I hope, someday, you might find it in your heart to forgive me, though I understand if you can't. Grace studied Diane's face for a long moment, searching for the sincerity beneath the words. What she found surprised her. Genuine, raw remorse, the kind that only comes from nearly losing everything that matters. I forgive you, Grace said quietly, not because what you did was acceptable, but because carrying that anger would only poison the love I have for Lily. I forgave you the moment I heard she needed help. That's simply who I choose to be. Warren, gathering his courage, made an offer he hoped Grace would accept. Grace, I would like you to come back, not as household staff, not as an employee expected to disappear into the background, but as a permanent, valued member of this family's life, with a position and a salary that reflects what you actually mean to us. And beyond that, I want to help you finish your education, the nursing degree you once dreamed of before life got in the way. It's the very least we owe you. Grace considered this for a long moment. She thought of Rosalind Carter, who had shown her genuine kindness when she had nothing. She thought of the independence she had slowly rebuilt over the past year, painful as it had been. And she thought of Lily, the girl who had never stopped loving her, even when the adults around her had failed so completely. I'll come back, Grace finally said, for Lily. But things will be different this time. I will not be invisible in this house ever again. I will not eat standing in a kitchen while you dine at your table. I will be treated as a person, always, not just in moments of crisis. Agreed, Warren said immediately. And for the first time in the entire conversation, something that resembled genuine relief crossed his face. Completely agreed. True to his word, everything changed after that. Grace returned to the Hargrove household, but this time as a woman who commanded respect, not out of fear or pity, but because she had proven, in the most extreme circumstance imaginable, exactly what kind of character she carried within her. Warren funded her nursing education, which she pursued part-time over the following years while continuing to be a central figure in Lily's life. Diane, humbled by how close she had come to losing her only daughter, slowly began to soften, spending more time with Lily herself, learning from Grace's example what it truly meant to show up for someone with consistency and warmth, rather than conditional affection. Lily made a full recovery, and the safety protocols at Hargrove Pharmaceuticals were overhauled from top to bottom, ensuring that the kind of oversight that nearly cost Lily her life could never happen again. The treatment she and her father had spent years developing eventually completed its trials successfully, and went on to help thousands of patients suffering from the autoimmune condition it was designed to treat. A legacy Lily would carry forward herself years later when she took over leadership of the company's research division, with Grace, by then a licensed nurse, still one of the closest people in her life. Years later, when Lily gave a speech at a medical conference honoring the launch of a new expanded treatment program, she spoke not about her father's business acumen or her own scientific achievements, but about the woman who had raised her more than anyone else, who had been discarded by her family for the crime of being poor, and who had returned without a trace of bitterness to save the very people who had wronged her. My family judged her worth by her bank account, Lily told the room full of doctors and researchers, when in truth, she was the richest person any of us ever knew, rich in character, in loyalty, in a kind of love that doesn't ask what it will receive in return. I am alive today because of her, and I am the person I am today because of her. So here is the truth this story leaves us with. Never judge someone's value by the size of their paycheck or the humility of their circumstances. The people the world overlooks, the caregivers, the housekeepers, the ones treated as invisible, often carry more wisdom, more strength, and more love than those who look down on them ever will. Treat people with dignity, not because of what they can do for you, but because it is simply the right way to live. You never know whose hands might one day hold the thing you love most in this world. If this story touched you, if it reminded you of the quiet, unseen people in your own life who deserve more gratitude than they receive, take a moment right now to like this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and leave a comment telling us which part of Grace's story moved you the most. Your support helps us keep bringing these stories to life every single day. And if you know someone who needs a reminder today that kindness always finds its way home, share this video with them. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.
Please subscribe to my YouTube channel and support me. Thank you so much. I love you all. Bye!